My name is Gerald Caden, and I am a professor of urban planning and design here at the Graduate School of Design. And I'm delighted not exactly to see all of the audience because I can't see any of you, but I'm delighted that you are all here and I sense your presence. Indeed, we're all dressed up and ready to go. So I'm really thrilled to welcome back to the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and the Department of Urban Planning and Design, Linda Shi. Linda is a graduate of our urban planning program, but I'll get to that in a moment. This is the first public lecture of the 2020-2021 academic year. And for this lecture, we really could have zoomed in most anyone from, well, anywhere in the world. We could choose any topic to address. Linda Shi is the perfect fit for that zoomed in person and for the topic to be addressed this evening. Let's face it. Indeed, we have to face it. Climate change is upon us, and the sooner we face up to the challenges it presents, the better off all of us and future generations will be. What especially makes climate change such a particular challenge is that it is a slow onset disaster, meaning that we can go about our daily lives and not always sense its presence. And then something terrible happens that we often give first names to, like Katrina, or Sandy, or Maria, or Harvey, or the Bay of Bengal's super cyclone Umpun, not a first name. Or we see a video of a huge piece of ice fall away from a glacier into the ocean. Or we see persistent flooding in Miami or Bangladesh, or right here in Boston, we experience the king tide at Long Wharf. And then there's the foundational question of who is we as we experience. And the disturbing reality is that too many individuals, part of we, who are negatively impacted by climate change are and will be members of society who are already among the most vulnerable because of economic status, because of racial discrimination, or because of a number of other factors. One of the first books I recommend to students that I teach about disasters and climate change is entitled, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a natural disaster," edited by Chester Hartman and Gregory Squires and published in 2006, 14 years ago. And by the way, Hartman received his PhD in city and regional planning at the design school and taught here as well. I think that title says it all and says it well. Is climate change a natural disaster? It is at the end what we will make of it, through efforts to mitigate the emission of greenhouse gas emissions, and through efforts to adapt to its effects, many of which are sadly already baked into the cake. And whatever is done must robustly address the impact of climate change on the most vulnerable members of society and make sure that all outcomes are just and equitable for all. And that brings me to the design school's first guest of the year in the public lecture program. Linda Shi, Master in Urban Planning 2008, is Assistant Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. Her research concerns how to plan for urban climate adaptation in ways that improve environmental sustainability and social justice. She assesses how aspects of urban land governance, including the fiscalization of land use, property rights regimes, and metropolitan regional institutions, shape climate vulnerability and adaptation responses. She is an urban environmental planner by training and has a strong background in the professional world, in addition to the academic world, having worked for AECOM, the Institute for International Urban Development, and the Rocky Mountain Institute, and consulted for the World Bank and the American Institute of Architects on projects and research in the United States, in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Professor Shi received her PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, her master's in planning, urban planning, as I mentioned earlier, from our school, and a bachelor and master's degrees in environmental management from Yale and the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Let me add that Professor Shi is one of the most cited and exciting professors who over the past decade has made the academic side of climate change dynamic and instructive. So please join in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Linda Shi. And Linda, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Wonderful to see you, and thank you so much, Gerald, for that really lovely introduction about the topic and about me. There's a very special sense of joy and really a sense of redemption the first time you're invited to speak at your alma mater. I only wish that I could be there in person speaking at Gund Hall. Although I confess that last week in the lead up to preparing for this talk, I had an anxiety dream one night. And in the dream, I wasn't nervous about talking, but while I was lecturing at Gund Hall, my car got ticketed and towed, and then I came out into the dark of night with no means of transportation, and it started snowing. So I apparently have some deep-seated subconscious memories about Boston, so maybe it's for the best that I give this lecture remotely. I see among the attendees lots of familiar names of students, former and current, and colleagues and friends. It's lovely to be here virtually with all of you tonight. Thanks for joining in. In all seriousness, I am really honored to be starting off this lecture series this particular year. This year has been devastating for cities, and these crises emanate from compounding disasters, political, racial, economic, environmental, that have been brewing for decades. And they invite us, both as residents of cities and as professionals of fields engaged in urban development, to reflect on what this means for our fields of practice and research. Do we do what we have been doing, but more vocally, more urgently, more at a larger scale? In other words, is it our position that if only there were more of us, more planners, more designers, some of these problems would not be so imminent and so pressing? And in a self-serving way, I hope that's the case. We want more of ourselves. But the soul searching that this moment calls for, I think, also compels us to really reflect on how planning and design have been complicit in the inequality and the unsustainability of the urban realm. Planning has said its mea culpas about exclusionary zoning and urban renewal and inadequate student and faculty diversity in our schools. But our institutions of planning and design education also need to reflect even more deeply on the orientation of our theories, our sites, our sources of inspiration, in order to train a new generation of young professionals who lead a different kind of practice. So in today's lecture, I take up these questions from the perspective of green infrastructure, things like wetlands and sand dunes, and their role in minimizing flood risk in cities. And this may seem like an odd choice, maybe a tangential issue far from the core dilemmas of affordable housing, police violence, unemployment, and citizenship that affect our cities. I look at green infrastructure not because it is the grand solution to climate change or even to inequality. Rather, I take up green infrastructure to show how so often when we lift up a particular technology as a solution, we do so without considering the social, political, and policy context surrounding urban development and the implications that that technology has beyond the immediate goals, which are in this case flood risk reduction. And in so doing, we tend to reinforce the biases and the blind spots in theory and in practice that have contributed to the continually unsustainable and unjust conditions in which we find ourselves. So if we are to change how we do things for greater justice and greater sustainability, then everything we do, including something seemingly so narrow and technical as green infrastructure for flood risk reduction, can be conceived of as pathways towards these goals. Now, if you are tuning in tonight, I suspect you are curious or concerned or frustrated about the increasing frequency and the increasing geographic extents of flooding in cities. And Gerald mentioned a number of these kinds of events all over the world. Scenes like this from Boston's Seaport District in 2018, or like this, which is flooding in Scituate, a suburb of Boston, also that year. And it has led to apocalyptic imagery, both real and imagined, of what happens under climate change when cities are unprepared. I think it's important to look out into the future, not to rile up a sense of climate hysteria, but to know what the trend line is and then work backwards to know what the next right action might be. Downscaled climate models like Climate Ready Boston's Map Explorer, which you see here, they're increasingly common all over the country, and they consistently show worsening floods over the course of the century in our cities. I should note that sea level rise is the most conservative estimate when we talk about flood extents. It's very severe because it indicates a permanent state of things being underwater, but floods caused by rain and by storm surge and by riverine flooding, they are also intensifying over time with intensifying climate change, and their geographic reach covers a much larger area in coastal and riverine areas, and they can similarly affect our well-being far in advance of permanent inundation caused by sea level rise. There's a new group, the First Street Flood Lab, that has developed a new model that does what the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, says that it cannot do, at least not without $11 billion. With the support of researchers, they have modeled floods, taking into account historic rainfall events coupled with future projected climate conditions. And their assessment that was launched this summer finds that nearly twice as many homes are at risk compared to what FEMA has previously estimated. That's about 14.5 million properties at risk of a so-called 1 in 100 year storm today, or 16.2 million properties by 2050. So this suggests there's a massive spatial mismatch between where people live and work today. And the question confronting all of us, of course, is what's to be done? The immediate response is, of course, let's put up a wall. Since the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, in this country, we have put up thousands of miles of levees and dikes. And cities from the San Francisco Bay Area to Miami to Manhattan, they have all proposed at one time or another some major wall-like structure to keep the water out. And each of these costs about $4 to upwards of $10 billion each. Many of these take inspiration from the Dutch Maasland storm surge barrier, which is protecting the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It is one of the largest movable man-made objects on Earth. We see this most directly in proposals for the Ike Dike to protect the city of Galveston, Texas. This was first proposed in 2006 after Hurricane Ike, and Hurricane Laura this summer has sparked renewed interest in reviving this project. Similar proposals have been made for Boston for the last 20 years, and it's a proposal to link various arrangements of the Boston Harbor Islands and to prevent deadly storm surge or sea level rise from impacting the urban center. As a UMass Boston study showed, however, it is neither cost-effective nor practical. There are lots of differences between our coastal conditions and that of the Netherlands, from the fact that they don't experience major hurricanes, to the fact that Maasland extends across a river and not a coastal harbor, to the fact that in places like Southeast Florida, the bedrock is actually made of limestone, which means that water will come up from below and not just from the coast. Moreover, with the gridlock that we see in Washington, D.C., it is hard to imagine the gridlock and the anti-urban stance that the federal government has. And it's hard to imagine the federal government doling out billions upon billions of dollars for each of our major cities to build one of these structures. But we did spend $14 billion on the Big Dig in Boston and another $14 billion shoring up the levees in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. But even if the most politically powerful cities win some windfall funding, it is unlikely that most of our municipalities along the coast and along rivers will be able to get the needed funds to protect every community. So over the past couple of years, words that previously had been taboo, things like managed retreat, planned relocation, resettlement, have become very widespread in the media, at least in the news that I read. Many advocates are now calling for residents to move out of harm's way ahead of a disaster, or to stop rebuilding after a disaster when their home gets significantly damaged. And FEMA also is moving in this direction. It has adopted a policy requiring local governments to use eminent domain to remove residents who do not voluntarily relocate, or the whole city will lose the post-disaster federal funding for recovery. It's apparent that the unsustainable nature of the National Flood Insurance Program and the fiscal risks that the federal government has towards climate change is leading it to adopt rather unprecedented and very controversial measures in order to reduce the flood risk that we see in coasts. In parallel with these developments, we've seen renewed attention towards green infrastructure, also called low-impact development and nature-based solutions. Historically, green infrastructure has been applied at the scale of a building or a street or a neighborhood to manage things like combined sewer overflows and water quality and urban heat island. But more recently, many groups from the Nature Conservancy to FEMA have embraced the use of nature to reduce flood risks. And this means things like systems of coastal wetlands and vegetated sand dunes, oyster reefs, restored floodplains, greenways. It's possible to install small-scale versions of any of these systems, and many cities have begun to do so. But they are more likely, if they are small, to be completely washed away in a major storm and not have the ability to self-repair. So if we want ecosystems services, then we need to operate these technologies at ecosystem scales, which means a scale of coastlines and watersheds. This is true especially as climate change becomes increasingly severe. The growing influence of green infrastructure has been very clear in the fields of design, and you see this in the recent proposals for resilient landscapes. Among the most evocative images are those proposing a Meadowlands National Park between New Jersey and New York, designed by a team led by MIT's Center for Advanced Urbanism, or a gray and green infrastructure wall around Lower Manhattan, designed by the Bjarke-Ingels group, all as part of the Rebuild by Design competition in 2013 after Hurricane Sandy. One entry in Boston's Living with Water Design competition of 2014 was advised in part by GSD professor Alex Krieger, and it imagines a new resilient waterfront in the Fort Point Channel with these floodable parks. Most recently, we've had yet another Rebuild by Design competition funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this, of course, features still more proposals to use natural ecosystems to mitigate flooding and to open new opportunities for urban recreation. And perhaps the most ambitiously, when A.R. Siders and Rosetta Elkin were here at Harvard, they spoke of creating a new national seashore to permanently make this new flooded landscape ecologically restored and then turn it to be part of the public domain so that the waterfront, our coastlines, would not be private, but actually public. I love the ambition of these projects. They give us inspiration to work towards a vision instead of to shrink from past times. They have a scale of design imagination that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge in front of us. And this is what design does at its best. But at the same time, as a planner, I am wary of the feasibility of these proposals and the impacts that they can have on the most disadvantaged groups. So let me first turn to this question of whether getting landscape scale urban greening is possible within the urban development landscape that we have in the United States. In the current development context, the federal government is responsible for building dams and levees and things like storm surge barriers. This creates a levee effect where people believe it is now safe to live behind a levee, oblivious to the fact that sooner or later there will be a storm that is big enough to supersede that protection. States have devolved also their planning authority to local governments. For the most part. And in the past, when local governments have tried to enact more stringent coastal development regulations, property owners sue for a takings without just compensation, making other local governments that much less likely to follow suit with these kinds of regulations. More recently, the opposite has happened, where local governments have tried to not keep rebuilding a road over and over again if it's consistently washed out by a storm because they can't afford to do so. And landowners have sued for an inverse condemnation, a takings of property because the government failed to take action. Then once a disaster strikes, either the national disaster recovery funding begins to flow from the federal government, or flood insurance begins to kick in to help individual landowners help them to begin to rebuild. Now, if you don't have insurance, you are probably poor, and local governments would prefer you move so that wealthier people who can afford to elevate their properties can come back in. And finally, there is a lot of incentives on local governments to develop because they rely on property taxes in order to fund a lot of local service delivery. And so what all this adds up to, the sum total of this reality, is that there is little relationship today between so-called natural hazards and land use planning at the local level. What we see then happening in local governments is that even those places that have strong climate awareness, where the leadership is committed, where they have mapped their climate vulnerabilities, and where they are advocating for green infrastructure and living shorelines and adaptation, they are also actively undertaking new dense developments in the very places that they know will be underwater within decades. So in this 3D map from Miami in Florida, you see the recently completed, under construction, planned, and proposed, mostly condo towers that have been planned in this city. This is from 2017, but I do not think the situation has changed dramatically since then. And the city of Miami is a member of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact and the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities. In the San Francisco Bay Area, you'll see a design competition proposal for Foster City. It's a suburban development built on fill in the 1970s and nicknamed the Venice of the West because it is so very low-lying. You'll see this proposal talking about how are we going to find ways for this city to grapple with sea level rise. And FEMA had proposed to extend the entire flood map across the whole city so that everyone would end up having to pay flood insurance. And then in the next city over, Redwood, they'll be considering a proposal from Cargill to redevelop its former salt ponds and turn it into a subdivision of 25,000 people. And there's a lot of adaptation planning in the Bay Area as well. The communities around Harvard and Boston are also not immune. Nearly all of the cities in Massachusetts have now completed a vulnerability assessment because the state has required that. And each of the cities in the urban core of Metro Boston, even so, is citing their largest new developments in areas currently in the floodplain or that will be chronically underwater by 2100. So far from giving land back to Mother Nature in line with principles of green infrastructure or managed retreat or precautionary principles, we are continuing to put new development in at-risk areas and committing cities to either protecting these new residents in perpetuity or to engage in relocation of these new dense developments sometime in the future. There are lots of reasons why cities develop, when and how and where they do. But one of them assuredly is the local reliance on property taxes in the United States. Rising fiscal austerity, which we are seeing very much in 2020, has historically translated into fiscal austerity at the state levels, which in turn then devolves their responsibilities to the local level without commensurate compensation and transfers of funding. And at the same time, taxpayer revolts in most states have restricted local property tax rates and rate increases such that you can, such that increasing the base value or the total amount of property or the number of residents becomes really central to how municipalities are able to raise their revenues. In addition, we have very high fragmentation in the United States. On average, each of our metropolitan areas has about 100 municipalities, many of them quite small, so that especially if they are built out, it is not easy to say, we're going to convert coastal development back into nature, or we're going to forego post-industrial waterfront development opportunities because that's the right thing. Our design proposals, so they need to reveal these limitations, right? How much land do we actually need to seed and convert into green infrastructure? And how much protection might we get from it? is that actually feasible? And if it's not feasible, if what we're asking with these proposals is not feasible for the current landscape of municipal governments, then what is going to give? Are designs going to give? They're going to become just a small amenity, a decorative feature that looks good and sounds good, but does not actually provide the ecological function? Or do we need to really quite fundamentally consider the fiscal division of sources and uses of local budgets and state and federal funding, or even redrawing administrative boundaries so that there is greater possibility of collective planning and implementation? My second concern is that this transformation of any land that we cede to Mother Nature might contribute to processes that are already underway for climate gentrification and displacement. Any kind of resilience upgrade for a building or for a park costs a lot of money. And there is not that much of that to go around these days, and so cities choose where it goes. So first of all, there's a question of who decides who is going to get this protection, and it's very political and contested. Very often, cities will prioritize their downtown areas, and that is where you see each of those big walls that are being proposed. They're all around downtown areas because cities need those tax dollars, and those are the core areas generating revenues for cities. Not to mention there's a lot of political influence of major landowners. But what if they invest because of a great deal of mobilization? What if they invest it for a poor community? Many community and environmental justice organizations are advocating that resilience investments have to prioritize their communities. But if you analyze urban greening projects, we find that typically urban greening is associated with increases in property value, which in turn often leads to gentrification. So even if frontline communities get it, they may not get to hang on to it for long. And so I think this point is very key because many people who are doing this work right now, they are saying, wow, we are becoming more and more cognizant of racism and discrimination and segregation. And so we have to work in ways that are more equitable. We have to focus and prioritize our poorest communities. And if you are prioritizing the poorest communities for resettlement and relocation, that leads to direct displacement effects. Or if you invest in those communities without other additional policy assurances to change property taxation, renters' rights, and rent and home ownership property values, then we will inevitably see displacement in an indirect way through processes of gentrification. The form of greening that takes place also makes a difference. And very often our restoration projects focus on ecological restoration to protect the properties that remain so that they can sustain their property values. And we focus also on creating recreational amenities. Importantly, there's a study recently done by Alessandro Rigolon and Jeremy Nemeth, and that study asks, do park location size and function affect whether a place gentrifies or not? And they found that it wasn't the size per se of the park that produces gentrification, but the kinds of amenities that that park has to offer. And certain kinds of amenities, certain forms of recreation are attractive, especially to middle class groups, professional classes, white collar tech workers, and that these, along with other amenities like certain types of housing and transportation, can together catalyze gentrification. So let's take, for example, St. Petersburg, Florida, and its neighboring cities in Pinellas County, just across the bay from Tampa. This is a region, because it sticks out into the Gulf, that's highly exposed to sea level rise and coastal flooding, which increases over time. And so this is the projected chronic inundation for flooding in 2030, in 2060, and in 2100. And if you translate that, which we did in a very labor-intensive effort to collect this data, but if you convert that then into what is the amount of property that is threatened by sea level rise, and again, that's a very conservative measure, how does that translate into the current impact? What is the scale of that tax revenue that might be lost for the municipalities' current budgets? And what you can see is that the long-term sea level rise or near-term storm events, they threaten over half the current revenue streams of the towns on the barrier island, which tend to be quite small and also quite wealthy. And by contrast, St. Petersburg sees quite significant impact, but it is comparatively much less, somewhere between 10 and 25%. So what happens if these barrier towns cannot find the funds to protect their communities? Maybe they will move somewhere else altogether. They say, screw it, I'm going to North Carolina. Or maybe they will move to somewhere else in mainland St. Petersburg and they will drive up property prices there, or drive up property prices somewhere in North Carolina. When you look at the socioeconomics of this region, we see that the mainland areas that are on higher land tend to be disproportionately Hispanic or not white, whereas the barrier islands tend to be predominantly white. And if you look at the poverty rates, they are also much poorer by comparison on the mainland. And that means that the housing is also much cheaper. And so that makes it much more attractive to developers who are looking for new places to build, especially if St. Petersburg does something very sensible, like increase the zoning to accommodate more housing on higher land. And so even though that is quite sensible, inevitably what that does is attract development and ends up displacing people. So when we analyze how much of the current tax base is threatened by sea level rise, we find that these risks are clearly unevenly spread. Some places take a big hit, and others won't be that much impacted even at 6 feet of sea level rise. So if we only think at the local level, which is the level where most of these conversations are happening because there's so little of it at the state and federal levels, we find that there is a landscape of relative prosperity and wealth today, and that is likely to change over time as some places become more attractive to residents and developers, and others become potentially trapped in cycles of shrinking property values, shrinking tax revenues, and declining municipal services. We see this dynamic already underway in Miami, where property values are falling, or at least they are not growing as fast in Miami Beach, while other places on the mainland, especially on the upland ridge of Southeast Florida, is growing much faster. And places like Little Haiti, a historically disinvested community that is situated between the region's 2 north-south highways, are gaining a lot of property development interest. And then there are places that are not attractive to growth at all, like Troy, New York. And people like author Virginia Eubanks write that they're seeing home foreclosures and abandonment because people there who are living in low-lying areas cannot afford their rising insurance premiums. So they are underwater, financially underwater, long before, physically speaking, they are underwater. So inevitably, these conflicts are about who gets protection, who has to move. Where do they move to? What kind of support, or any, they will receive? And all of this rehashes our existing issues of racism and segregation. The fragmentation that our metropolitan regions have is not unrelated to this history, the history of communities wanting to incorporate in order to segregate themselves from other races or other classes and to safeguard their taxes and their tax rolls from regional redistribution. So this ability to shuttle low-income, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous groups from one municipality, a bounded geography, to another is closely interlinked with how we draw our municipal administrative boundaries. So as I noted in our beginning, all of our institutions and all of our built environment, it is implicated in racism, in classism, in unsustainable development. You pick up any stone like green infrastructure and we will see how all of our plans and choices for climate change are shot through with these histories and implications for race and equity. So if these deeper structural issues are central to the challenges of climate adaptation and flooding, we come again to that perennial planning question, what's to be done? And so in this remainder of the talk, I want to spend some time sharing some ideas and provocations that really just come from my own soul searching this year about what do we do and where do we go in a post-2020 year. So the first thing I'd like to suggest is that we change and shift our gaze to sites off the map. Why do we look at the places we do for inspiration? Why do we favor some solutions over others? Whose stories do we elevate and why? In the history of Western development and planning, we perennially divide the world into urban or rural. It's either conserved or developed, as if there is no option in between. You see this very clearly in a quite famous diagram by Ebenezer Howard, the Garden Cities, where development is contained in these small cities and villages, and then every piece of land beyond it has this nice little assigned responsibility. It's a farm or a ranch. It's a mine or an insane asylum. And then you see on top Patrick Getty's very famous transect that's neatly arranging all of this land and development in a very linear progression from the mountain all the way down to the ocean. And again, everything is one purpose, one site. Even John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, they came to an agreement to create the system that has our national parks. Some places are untouchable, and they removed Native Americans who were living in those areas. And then we can develop and use all the rest. So there's one side of things that really foundationally shape our worldview about cities. And then there are other theories and modes of seeing that begin with John Friedman's world city hypothesis. And it goes on to today's global cities, smart cities, resilient cities. We train our gaze on the metropoles of the world, which are predominantly those of the industrialized and developed nations of the global north. So when it comes to adaptation planning, it is not surprising that we look to the Dutch for ideas about how to live with water. They are very central to this European notion of greater development and sophistication. My colleague Kian Go, who is actually here in the audience today, she has written very incisively and observed that the Dutch were a colonial superpower. Their territories covered the most precious of the colonial jewels of the 1600s, and their domination over Java, which is now Indonesia, made them the wealthiest of European nations of that time, and it transferred tremendous wealth that accumulated over time. The transformation spatially of the lowlands into what it is today, a cultivated, protected landscape, is not unrelated to this history of colonization far beyond Dutch borders, although this history is so very rarely mentioned when cities court the Dutch for expertise in solving their cities' problems. So why do we admire the water squares of Rotterdam, but we forget the Balinese rice paddies and rice terraces that are a UNESCO World Heritage Site? To hear the Dutch speak of it, you would think that they are the only people who have learned to live with water. And that's a truth you can scarcely believe if you go anywhere or in Asia or indeed in any place around the world that has a lot of rain. So in truth, what the Dutch give us is one set of strategies representing one way to live with water and with nature more broadly. One of the most exciting projects, adaptation projects going on right now, is the Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor. And this seeks to rebuild the incredible oyster shelves that once existed across the eastern seaboard of the United States. Oysters grew to be as long as a foot. I'm not sure how you would eat that. But the project is working with seafood restaurants to collect shells, and these shells are going to seed the future of the baby oysters, and eventually this bivalve army is going to build a natural structure that is a form of surge protection, even as it is also purifying the waters of the Hudson Bay. This project also dedicates itself, as it says here on their website, to public education and building a new generation that cares for the health of the harbor. But why is it that in this project, we often forget the history of the clam beds that have been used by Native Americans in the Northwest dating back as far as 3,500 years ago to the present? Or that tribal nations sustainably harvested these oyster shelves and managed them on the eastern seaboard for thousands of years. So these technologies come with histories, with social structures, with organizations that sustain them, and the re-emergence or the popularization of these technologies should also provide opportunities to acknowledge that history and to restore indigenous people's knowledge and the power that comes with that knowledge. A small portion of FEMA funding for disaster recovery goes towards buying repetitively flooded properties, and then you demolish the home that was there, thereby eliminating the flood risk. When we look at this study, as Elisa Zavar and Ron Hagelman did in 2016, they studied about 10,000 parcels that the government had bought out between 1990 and 2000, about a quarter of what has been bought out to date. And what they found was that when you look at what's been left behind, and it's been there around for 20 years now, you see that about 40% of it is now devoted to recreation, ball fields, trails, running paths, picnic areas. And then about 40% is a vacant lot. That's either grass or asphalt. Only about 7.5% has been restored to a wetland or some other non-wetland kind of prairie meadow grass, for instance. And then as little as 5% is doing anything particularly productive in terms of agriculture. So why do we have 40% of this land lying vacant when we have so many communities that are food insecure, who are land poor, and for whom growing food is not about fancy herbs for some fancy Brooklyn hipster dining restaurant, but actually is core to poverty alleviation and the creation and the celebration of community, identity, and history? Why do we designate land only as being for restoration when other places have found ways to sustain both agriculture and biodiversity? In northern Miyagi Prefecture, which is what you're seeing here in Japan, 92% of this area's wetlands have been lost to development or to rice agriculture cultivation. But the remaining wetlands and the surrounding rice paddies have been preserved for flood detention basins since 1970. The government has tried to protect these wetlands, which now are part of international Ramsar protected wetland site designation. And it has also supported a new practice of winter flood rice paddy so that there is winter habitat for the protected white-fronted goose. Or you could take East Calcutta in East Calcutta in India, and they have a 48 square miles of wetlands. It's another Ramsar site, and it treats a third of the city's sewage, has fish ponds, agriculture, and employs some 20,000 people. These examples, just two of many different forms of agroecological systems, point to the possibility of much more complex and multi-layered ways that we could be using these spaces of transition. Geographers Jennifer Rice and Brian Burke have written that the hegemony of liberal, wealthy, environmental cosmopolitics has stifled our imagination for the many possible forms that sustainability efforts can take. What these examples suggest is that we should expand our gaze beyond traditional sites of wealth, power, and ecological domination, but to include those who sit, as geographer Jennifer Robinson writes, as being off the map. My colleague Nima Kudva at Cornell has taught me to see that these terms we use, global north and global south, are not so much geographic divisions, but a condition of privilege or marginalization. In this sense, the homeless person in LA has more in common with the pavement dweller of Mumbai than with people living in the rest of their city. So following this logic, our adaptation and our urban greening imaginations would do well to turn our gaze to the multiple souths, both internationally as well as those that already exist within the country. We also have to think about issues of land governance, from land rights to tax policy to boundary drawing, so that it is possible for local governments and communities to make the choices we would like to see them make. How do we make sense of a map that looks like this? Can municipal boundaries stay the same along our coasts if significant levels of environmental change happens? Given the realities that we see, do we expect municipalities, not necessarily the biggest and most powerful ones like Boston, Miami, San Francisco, New York, but the average ones, the suburbs, the many other coastal communities, what do we expect them to do? If their choices are constrained, then how do we change and adapt our governance institutions and boundaries? How do we open our policy, planning, and political imaginations the way that designers are trained to do by default? To me, a very critical issue here is that when we look at this and you look at the fiscal pictures and it looks unsustainable, there's essentially two responses that one might imagine. One is that we should, let me go here. One is that we should be thinking about changing our taxes, perhaps, so that municipalities have greater access to resources that they do not currently have. Maybe there is some kind of regional sharing of resources or a federal sharing of resources to make possible for municipalities to begin to get out of the coast. Or we might imagine changing political boundaries, administrative boundaries, so that if there is a larger land area over which to grow and spread housing and development, then not everybody has to hold on and develop to the gills, to the very last moment until the music stops. And can we do so in ways that redress the historic wrongs that these same policies of taxation, of administrative incorporation have created? This is a racial dot map that shows one dot per person colored by their race, and it shows segregation nationwide. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look it up, and you can explore the entire country and what your particular city looks like. There's a number of places that are now talking about regional governance and coordination for climate adaptation and watershed planning. This is from Miami to Boston to Texas, California, Washington State. And people are starting to think about adaptation planning beyond the local level so that they can work to coordinate planning and infrastructure, for example, so that a road that goes through multiple jurisdictions is going to be consistently the same number of feet above sea level. But these policies of regional watershed and floodplain management do not yet address the issues of land fiscalization and boundary drawing, which have close nexus of issues with race and segregation. Yesterday, I gave another talk for the GSD in the Climate Change Adaptation Lecture Series that Gerald has organized at the GSD. And this question came up of what is going to cause municipalities to actually merge or change. Historically, some of that pressure comes from the federal government. This is why we have metropolitan planning organizations and regional councils of government. But even if the federal government will require some form of regionalism or to incentivize collaboration, ultimately it comes down to state and local decisions about whether or not they would change their boundaries. What would trigger it? Is it going to be some higher level of disasters? Is it going to be a change in how FEMA redistributes its post-disaster funding, or how insurers and lenders change so that there's a drastic devaluation of coastal properties? Will it be fiscal collapse that forces governments eventually to put boundary changes to a vote in front of their governments, in front of their constituencies? Tonight's talk has been focused on flooding, but some of these same dynamics play out with wildfires, which is burning in so much of the West right now. So what will it take? How bad does a disaster have to be? How much do local services have to crumble before we are willing to think about the collective action challenges needed to challenge these systemic issues? We are not there yet, and we may not be there for a long time. So maybe I'm just speaking very idealistically, but these conversations have to happen eventually, and it takes a lot of trust to begin to have these conversations. If there is no trust currently between local governments with each other, if there is no trust between communities with any level of government because of historic neglect or actions that have been perpetrated, there's going to be very little faith that any larger scale move, so-called for equitable adaptation or green infrastructure or housing development, that any of that could actually stand to benefit people because they haven't seen it happen in the past. And so today, as this talk has touched on, there has been so many spheres that could be implicated and so many really interesting opportunities to be had from collaborative learning and problem solving. And that includes opening up the realms of practice to fields that historically have not been participating in green infrastructure planning. For instance, community development, community gardens in many places, Black, Hispanic, tribal immigrant communities, race and gender studies, farmers and agriculturalists, public health, to name some, in order to begin to design new kinds of models for how we might want to proceed. And in that process, I think researchers also have a lot to contribute and also have a lot to do in terms of collaborating across boundaries and the kinds of disciplinary silos that we ensconce ourselves in. There are all sorts of interesting questions about the feasibility or the possibility of one or another of these scenarios and how do they relate to one another across these different systems of social, economic, legal, land, and many other divisions. So if there is any expertise, I think, that has to be touted for this newly growing field of professional climate change experts, I would say that it should be emphasizing our ability to serve as integrators for bringing people to the table and moving them towards holistic problem solving that isn't currently happening. After my lecture yesterday, Gerald asked me if I was an optimist or a pessimist about the future of climate change adaptation. I don't think there's really much choice except to be an optimist. And if I were a pessimist, I would probably be at a culinary institute learning how to bake bread right now and just enjoy life while it lasts. But I am inspired by the growing numbers of people, including the growing numbers of students who are really passionate about these issues and who want to be working out there. So if we assume that the baseline scenario of what is going to happen, a lot of climate change, a lot of inequitable development, as dismal and depressing and taken per, as an of course, then any action that we do any action that we can commit to can only improve on that baseline. And that starts with critically reflecting on our methods, our theories, the sites of knowledge, and then imagining different solutions, whatever the topic is at hand. I don't think that green infrastructure alone can change the past 500 years of human history, but framing green infrastructure initiatives in relation to these barriers to justice and sustainable development can contribute to these goals. That concludes my lecture, and this talk is based on a publication, an open access publication that just came out this week, which you can download online. I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Great, Linda. That was terrific. Thank you very, very much. Let me say this. In my view, the loss to the world of bakeries is going to be society's overall gain. So I'm happy you're in the world of dealing with climate change. We have 30 minutes left. We're going to have a hard stop at 9 p.m. Eastern time. And we have questions and answers from our audience. And we've already had 9 questions submitted. We invite you to submit questions through the Q&A function, and it will be my job to read the questions that come in. If there are repetitive questions, I may skip over them. I won't mention your name in general, unless it's, well, I won't mention your name in general, unless there's a reason to do so. So let me start, and Linda, you're prepared to go. Here are questions from members of our audience. Somebody says, I'm curious about your thoughts about how the proposals for resiliency, for example, the rebuild by design proposals in New York, can be financed. And you did address this in part, but I suspect there's a little bit of skepticism, not about what you suggested, but about their financeability. So that's the question.
That is forefront on the minds of everybody, and I don't think that people have solved that by any means. There are proposals, anything from how do you valorize the absence of a disaster and the avoided losses of a municipality? Can you monetize that in some way? So for instance, if you pay into an insurance scheme and the insurance scheme is projecting you could have had so much loss, but then you didn't actually have it, then that gain affects the insurance rate, for instance, of what you are paying into. And perhaps that could be monetized. There's all sorts of schemes around that. There's talk about environmental impact bonds. So if you develop and build a natural infrastructure system and it delivers a certain amount of protection, then the services that it provides could be monetized, much as the ecosystem services of the Adirondacks or the Catskills for New York's water supply can be somehow built into this system. So there are schemes of that nature. Then there are proposals that the development itself is going to pay for that, right? So if you create a new resiliency district on the coast of, let's say, Boston, And there is a site where you're going to put in essentially like a business improvement district or a tax increment financing district. You can charge the development there, and you can levy some of that the capital gains of that site to fund the improvements of the site itself. I think there are major challenges with that approach because you basically have to commit to more development in order to get more revenue for adaptation, and it's a kind of chicken and the egg problem. And then, of course, there is federal transfers through major project changes, and that is a question of, can we change things like the National Flood Insurance Program so that it is more proactive in some way, as well as changing the insurance rates. This is what a lot of people in the fire industries are doing. So if we change the market incentives, anything from what is the insurance that you have to pay so that you're doing actuarial cost of the risk of flooding tied to science and the changes in sea level rise. What if you change the disclosure requirements on the sale of properties? What if you change bond ratings for municipalities so that you punish them for not taking action? All of these things can realign markets to steer people away from vulnerable places. This is not quite a financing proposal, because what it does is it changes the market and maybe disincentivizes development in low-lying places, but it doesn't necessarily generate new funding for protecting those kinds of places, and they would just devalue and, as I said, devolve into fiscal crises sooner. And so the last option is generally more funding. So if you wanted an $11 billion seawall for Boston or Miami, there would need to be greater congressional appropriations, and that has to be people, I'm not a financial expert. I don't know where we just came up with $2 or $3 trillion for COVID, but that is, whatever that lever is, one could take on more debt or print more money to do some of these kinds of projects. And that again gets to questions of all the political issues we have. How do you build the coalitions for generating that? There's a lot of people also saying you should raise utilities, you should raise property taxes, so only those people who are affected are paying in. This is not my problem. I didn't choose to live there. Why should I be paying my tax dollars to help that person get more infrastructure for their safety? And so there's a lot of questions of how small or big do you draw this circle of redistribution in terms of who is paying into the funds for resiliency.
Do you, by the way, compare the COVID crisis to the climate change crisis? Do you think that's a useful comparison, an instructive comparison?
I think it's certainly very instructive because it is a very complex dynamic that it's a complex disaster that affects so many different sectors, and they have compounding and intersecting impacts that reveals all of the underlying vulnerabilities that we had around healthcare, education, labor, wages, all of these, housing, drug addiction, like whatever it is, all of that is revealed. And when you have an ecological disaster, even if it sometimes seems very slow in coming out, it touches on the exact same issues of housing affordability, vulnerability, natural resource resiliency, infrastructure, and then all the social political dynamics that we have. Our inability to come towards a collective, coherent, consistent, coordinated response to COVID can only be an indication of our lack of ability to do so on climate change, which is absolutely what we're seeing.
And yet, as well, after the trillions that were offered and given that you referenced, now there's no money to deal with what still has to be trillions more dollars. There's an inadequate response from the national government, a paralysis. In any event, let's move on to other questions and to the other end of the scale. One of our participants says, you mentioned the type of amenities and parks being more attractive to people with higher incomes, that encourages more gentrification. Did I get that right? And if so, what are these types of amenities?
So I think you would have to look up that particular paper by, again, Alessandro Rigalon and Jeremy Nemeth. So I do not remember specifically if they categorized in that particular study that I was quoting, but you can imagine that there is a great deal of variation in the kinds of recreational amenities. Do you have a park, let's say Bryant Park, with seating and cafes and picnics for Frisbee, or do you have basketball courts, baseball fields, soccer fields, right? They cater in the recreation, even though there are, and some of them are not necessarily divided. Everybody can use a trail for running, but certain kinds of amenities are also related to class differences or related to age amenities and what is being offered. So I think that there is some distinguishment around that. I think what they did say is, for instance, a greenway that doesn't necessarily have recreation might be less impactful than one that adds recreational value as well.
Another question at a local geographic level. The president has dismissed the idea of spending money to build the Ike Dike in Texas. He says it's unproven and too expensive. Nonetheless, local officials are moving forward with the studies that are a prelude to the actual construction, with the goal of having construction completed by about 2040. Are you saying that a dike structure is not the right strategy for the indigenous conditions of the Texas Gulf Coast?
I can't claim to be an expert about the conditions of the Texas Gulf Coast, but if I understand this technology in general, and I know the Boston example better. In the Boston example, when you have these large gates, they are mostly open. And there's also an active port in Boston, and there's a port in shipping industries in Galveston as well. You have to have the boats come and go, so the gates cannot be closed. In the future, with storms increasingly frequent and tides increasingly high, you're going to have to open and close them more frequently. Now, first of all, the more you close them, the more affects port traffic, but also these kinds of structures are not designed to be opened and closed all the time like a pinball machine. They are gigantic. And so they are not easy to move, and I don't know if they're going to break more frequently or what it is, but it would be very difficult to have it open and close all the time. Now in the future, right, and so depending on how high or how big you want this dike to be, if you overbuild or you plan for the really long future, maybe you will get a longer time span, but for that cost, you're going to be paying for, let's say, a 6 foot higher or a 10 foot higher, some level of a barrier that you have to be opening and closing and building and maintaining. And the issue they were saying is, in order to build one of these things, right, you mentioned 2040, but between the time to begin to do feasibility, to design it, to get congressional approval, to then actually manufacture it, if you look at the big dig, these things take a long, long period of time. So by the time this thing actually gets built, sea levels are accelerating, right? Sea level rise is always an exponential curve, and the climate impact is accelerating. So you have more frequent storms, more severe storms, more sea level rise, and eventually you're going to have to just keep it closed all the time. Now maybe you say, hey, that's not so bad. I don't even care about the environmental impact assessment and the NEPA regulations that we have, that the Netherlands doesn't have quite so much of. But even so, eventually sea level rise is going to then overcome that. And so the question is it worth the expense to sink such an extraordinary amount of money? And in the case of the Boston example, in that study, it suggested actually smaller scale projects would actually be more worthwhile. Now, obviously, a question that has been raised by other surrounding municipalities of Boston has been to say, well, maybe Boston's going to get some smaller harbor out of this deal or some smaller seawall, but we're never going to be able to get those funding for even those smaller projects. So maybe it would be better to have a giant project that we can collectively lobby behind versus a smaller set of projects. But that is, again, a political issue rather than a technical feasibility issue.
Great. Another question. When we think about green infrastructure and its implication on social justice, what might you flag out as things we should not take off our gaze when we critically look at propositions for managed retreat or other solutions?
That's a terrific question. I think managed retreat, when thinking about any of these questions, I think we always have to think about it relationally, not only as what is happening to that particular site and that group, but also what's happening to others comparatively in that geography. And then relationally across geographies, what is happening to people between these sites of where they are relocating to, where they are moving from, and then where they are going to. So for instance, if we consider a very wise, sensible strategy, right, that somehow by a miracle, we elect somebody who says that we do want a national urban policy in this country. And this national urban policy looks at the National Climate Assessment and says, gosh, California and Arizona look like terrible places to sink continued investment in infrastructure and drive continued economic growth in those places because they're going to be so hot and so much on fire, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the Northeast or the Midwest with their proliferation of freshwater lakes, their availability of water, their vacancy rates right now, so much excess infrastructure from the industrial period. Wouldn't it be better to invest in these communities and engaged in both direct managed retreat or market incentives that draw people to migrate to these places? Very sensible strategy overall. What is going to happen to the communities that are actually the recipients of all of this kind of migration? And the same kind of dynamics that currently happen with any kind of metropolitan growth that we see in terms of housing unaffordability, rising property values, tax foreclosures as much as any other kind of foreclosures, those kinds of challenges are going to play out. And so I see in the question somebody else asked about what kinds of protections might you think of for these kinds of groups. Getting back to the issue of land governance, we are currently only thinking about the technical issues around, do you elevate this house or not? How do you insure it or not? We think at the household scale and the private property rights of that particular parcel. And any kind of place that has successfully resisted gentrification or engaged in community development, it has always been at the community scale and it has been at the collective scale. So I think we would have to, just as you might devise some kind of a TIF district for businesses, why do we not more often engage in conversations about cooperative land ownership and housing and development practices so that people who are there have rights to that land, have rights to stay in some place that is safe and are not always perpetually being displaced.
Great. Another question. Thanks for the lecture. I am a Penn Design Master of Landscape Architecture student, and this is my speculative question. Wildfire has shocked Silicon Valley venture capitalists. They have the exact same discussion as we are having here at the design school. How should we pitch them or pitch to them? And where are the exponential growth opportunities in climate adaptation? And you can interpret this question any way you want to, whether it's somebody who'd like to get money, make money, and do good at the same time.
Okay, I'm not quite sure if this question means how do we save Silicon Valley from the climate challenges, or how do we help Silicon Valley make more money through the climate transition?
I think it can be interpreted as both. How can we help Silicon Valley, and how can we see this all in as a growth opportunity from the design school point of view?
Interesting.
Whether it's Harvard or Penn or any other design school.
I'm surprised these days a student at Penn would be asking this question about how to help Silicon Valley, because that's not quite what I associate Penn with these days. But to your question, Silicon Valley, like much of the Bay, is a very challenging area to help, because on the one hand you have the wildfire risk in the mountains, and then on the other hand you have the flood risk in the Bay. So you are caught in a quite small sliver of land, and the question is, what do you do there? I don't know that we necessarily need to help them, because businesses have often found ways to overcome the kinds of challenges, whether that's globalization, where they move. And I mean, there are lots of studies showing how businesses, it's not as easy as you think to just pick up and move someplace, because there's a lot of transaction costs and devotion to place that comes with having the labor force you want in a particular place. But I think about how in the aftermath of 9/11, which is tomorrow, I don't know how many years ago, almost 20 years ago now, in the aftermath of 9/11, the federal government actively tried to deconcentrate and break up the agglomeration economies of Wall Street. So previously there was a lot of agglomeration economies and benefits to everybody, all of the fire, legal, insurance, banking, financial industries concentrating in the Wall Street area. And then the bombings made it very clear just how vulnerable the entire national system, including the federal government, which is a major client of Wall Street, how vulnerable it is to this particular sector going down. And so the federal government made it a policy of concentrating and breaking up and making these industries not be consolidated together. So many of them then moved to other parts of the region, to New Jersey, to Brooklyn, to Long Island, to other parts. And now lower Manhattan is not actually the centers of where these things are. And so I think that businesses have a way of recuperating, especially businesses that are as profitable as Silicon Valley is. They have such extraordinary sums to command that if they wanted to build a seawall themselves, I think they actually probably could do it. So that's a bit glib as an answer, but I think that you could also imagine, again, going towards longer term regional or even national planning solutions. If you had to make that choice, where would you put a Silicon Valley in the future? Because, you know, I didn't show this particular slide, but these folks in Forbes, there's a set of political scientists who are writing a lot in Forbes. They have proposed, why don't we put that kind of new green economy in the Rust Belt? A new, what did they call it? It's like a play on the China Belt and Road, like a Rust Belt and Green Road, a green Rust Belt and Road initiative for the United States. To your point of how businesses can get rich off of the climate transition, I also don't have that much concern, because a lot of businesses are very savvily actually adapting to these considerations much more quickly than the public sector. So as Jesse Keenan, who was a professor at the GSD, now at Tulane, has written about, there's been a small arms race by businesses to actually model the kinds of impacts, including, for instance, the First Street Flood Lab, trying to model just where their risks are going to be, because they want to know where are their assets going to be likely to be at risk, where are they going to lose profit margin, where are they going to have liabilities. And you see, again, in another study that Jesse did, that some of those smaller banks, not necessarily the big ones who are big enough not to care perhaps, but the smaller ones that are more local, those banks have been selling off their more vulnerable, low-lying, flood-prone mortgages or their loans to other banks. And so a lot of the sectors are very savvy and currently rapidly shifting. So the only person that doesn't think, not the only person, the only actor here, the major actor that does not think climate change is a challenge is the federal government at this moment.
All right, another participant asks or says, thank you so much for this talk, Linda, very inspiring. That's not a question, that's a statement. Agree with the issue with the Eurocentric vision. I recently moved to Europe for a PhD, and here there's a big emphasis on the nature-based solutions as an evolution of green infrastructure solutions. First, because the nature-based link challenges with solutions through a clear pathway for action. And second, in Europe, they embrace sustainable development goals more clearly. I am still not totally convinced of it, but would also like to hear your thoughts.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I don't know as much about nature-based solutions in Europe. I will say that they have made a much more concerted effort to think about this at a coordinated multi-level government approach. So at the EU level, they have been studying nature-based solutions for almost a decade, and they have created a whole framework around this. There is a kind of a similar NSF version there that is funding a lot of research around this, and they have many countries there have national policies around green infrastructure. So I think firstly that there is a lot more coordination that's happening in terms of what the government expectation is, how much priority this particular approach gets vis-a-vis alternative solutions. As to whether they address issues of equity, I couldn't say, how convincing this has been. When I was doing research on this topic, I was more drawn to some of the work that has been done internationally around nature-based solutions in development contexts. Because when you get to talking about nature-based solutions in, let's say, Sri Lanka or India or Bangladesh, it's always taken with a very holistic community-based development approach where people are thinking about the livelihoods of the people, the rights they have to their land, the ability of women to be empowered, how do they make collective decision making, how do you build up those institutions. When you get to the north, a lot of the projects tend to be primarily around flood infrastructure and major projects, and so it's a kind of ecosystems services approach. So I think that in that respect, maybe the European strategies may not be as different from the United States in that regard, but I don't know specifically to say.
Right. One of our audience members writes in, "Hi, Linda, thank you for a great lecture today. There seems to be unanimity on that aspect of this evening's talk, Linda." This person says, "As a polar science researcher, I am particularly interested in glaciers and permafrost melting that are happening in Alaska, with the native Alaskans being impacted the most. Is there any green infrastructure that may help in a subpolar or polar context such as Alaska?"
There are limits to my knowledge, and I think polar green infrastructure is maybe the boundaries of that. I will just say, for people on the line who may be not so familiar with what's happening in the poles, but climate change happens the fastest and the most intensely at the poles and in the tropics. So the groups that have contributed the least to climate change actually are experiencing it much faster. And so in the poles in Alaska, you're seeing much higher, like 30 degrees higher temperatures on certain days than historically. And the permafrost is melting very fast. And when you change the permafrost, all sorts of things like anthrax can come out and kill tens of thousands of reindeer herds, as it has happened in Russia. Or, your transportation routes cannot happen because you were depending on ice to be there, and now it cannot take place. A lot of cultural, indigenous life ways that are associated with the kinds of food production, cultural practices are endangered in this process. And so it is devastatingly sad. And there's not to say they are the canaries in the coal mine, but it is a lot of trauma that we have causing places that have not contributed to this. So I don't know technologically what we might do. I think that there is certainly a lot more that we could have in terms of indigenous communities being at the table of designing and creating these strategies. A larger issue is around the cost of the funding that we are willing to spend to redistribute in these communities adapting to things that they did not create.
Great. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and it would be nice to get in several more questions. So here is one. Shouldn't we also think of the ability of indigenous people to actually use and govern their own land as a critical component of this dialogue, if not its initial point of departure? Not to promote the generic model of the, quote, ecological Indian, unquote, but pointing to specific practices that drive fundamentally different land practice. For example, in Northern California, where the Yurok and Karok tribes are fighting for their traditional fire practices to be recognized and made legal.
I think Dane is absolutely correct. I very much agree with that. I think the McGurk, is it the case in Oklahoma that is recently transformed indigenous rights. Others have been happening for Seneca Nation in New York this summer. I think those are important steps in the right direction. And in pointing out those examples, I did not mean to signify that, there's a very romantic idea of what Native Americans are supposed to be like. There are also instances of Indian casinos that are located in floodplains, right? So I think that there's a lot that tribes could be doing on adaptation, and many of them have developed their own climate adaptation plans. If you're curious about that, there's a place you can Google online, and there's a whole collection of all the adaptation plans that a lot of tribes have developed. And some of those, I think it was the Blackfoot Reservation, the Blackfeet tribe that has, they talk about the 7 generations that they plan for when they're doing this kind of planning, not 20 years or 30 years or even 50 years. That is the longest that planning in Western context does, but a much longer term. And so I think that we, in planning, when I was, thinking about collaboration and mixing different groups, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can control what processes begin to unfold once you bring people to the table. And there is a lot that we should be actually trying to give people agency, not just corporations or the financial sector agency, but the agency of groups that have not historically had that control over what happens in their communities.
Great. Another question, what kind of soft or low-cost interventions do you think are most promising for low-income neighborhoods and fiscally strapped cities where large-scale transformations seem to be on the table?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Sure. What kind of soft or low-cost interventions do you think are most promising for low-income neighborhoods and fiscally strapped cities where large-scale transformation does not seem to be on the table? In short, are there smaller things that can be done? And by the way, let me read one final question to just frame it, because it's the opposite of this. Thank you so much for this lecture. Your optimism was contagious in a period of time when despair is a daily experience. Clearly, our approaches to risk reduction and equitable solutions within the United States alone are fractured. Many people have different approaches, but as we know, climate change and climate disasters are occurring on a global scale, though their effects are lived locally. Do you believe that a coordinated global response is worthwhile or feasible? What about a continental response, such as the Great Green Wall? Or are local regional efforts more nimble and therefore more impactful in their cumulative effect? So we have one person asking about small interventions for low-income neighborhoods and for fiscally strapped communities, and another person saying, don't we really have to handle this globally or continentally, or is it really all local?
Great questions. And the
you
issues.
And I should say, by the way,
I have 1 minute to answer this.
You have 2 minutes to answer. No, you take your time and then.
This is like a core issue. And first of all, I would say the international approach is absolutely necessary. And maybe the short answer is we need action at every single level. At the international level, the best form of adaptation is mitigation, and we cannot give up on that. If we stop mitigating, then the levels of climate change that we're going to experience is going to be unending. And that means so much more has to be done for so many more communities. I think that a national response doesn't necessarily have to mean a national piece of infrastructure like a Great Green Wall. It can also be policy responses or initiatives or funds that are devolved or required at smaller scales, because there is a lot that is different in terms of the physical experience of hazards in each place, as well as the social politics of what is happening. And it's been very clear from existing, so far, all of the adaptation that has happened, that contextual responses are very much necessary. So nobody's going to like you coming down and saying you have to do this because this other place is doing that. But I do think that, when you look to historically what we have seen in any kind of natural resource environmental management in the United States, it has been at that much larger level. So the Mississippi flood, you build that's a national initiative. When you talk about the Dust Bowl, the Soil and Water Conservation Service, the Great Prairie tree planting projects, those were at the national level. You're not asking every municipality to create their own green infrastructure plan and come up with funding to plant the trees. There is a conservation core that goes around and is trying to develop some of these strategies. And there's more recently, there are examples where there's been efforts to develop funding or give funds to the region as a whole. And so I think the design of how we deliver funding
that is typically very siloed. So you have your housing funding, your transportation funds, your water infrastructure, whatever funds, and they all are not fungible. So any municipality has to apply for dozens of kinds of grants to piece together a project, and they're often not flexible around them. So I think a very important question is, how do we design any of these funding packages? CDBG funds were one of them that is more flexible, but how do you do it at a scale so that actually we make it possible for municipalities to do it the right way? What can, in the end, if nobody has any money to give around and you are in a community that is very poor and the cavalry is not coming to save you, I think it's very challenging. Obviously it would have to happen at a community scale. The challenge is that many of our lowest income communities or communities that are affected don't have the kind of social capital that some of the best touted examples of, the Dudley Square Initiative or Uprose and Sunrise, Sunset Park, those kinds of projects have developed. A lot of these communities, because they are confronting constantly ICE, DACA, police violence, displacement, they are changing demographically, and there isn't that social cohesion. So where do you begin? Winifred Curran and Trina Hamilton have written about these ideas of just green enough and having smaller scale initiatives. In the immediate term, there is not necessarily going to be super high levels of climate change, and the smaller technologies are possible, and smaller social interventions. We talked about this yesterday in Gerald's class around building adaptive capacity, building people's incomes and their abilities to contribute to projects or to contribute to their general economic well-being can, in the longer term, build their ability to do more, whether that's lobbying or advocacy or something else. I guess I'll answer here a question that came up yesterday at the end that Gerald asked that I didn't fully get a response that I liked to, which was, if you have only, let's say, $10, do you invest in reducing inequality, or do you invest it in climate adaptation? Was that your question, right? We see this a lot in the kind of trade-off, right? Like, why are we saddling this very complex and controversial issue of climate change or climate adaptation or climate mitigation with this whole climate justice, racial justice question? And I would say that if all of the things that we are talking about right now requires policy change to change regulations, to change mandates, expectations around what are the requirements or incentives, as well as policy change around the kinds of funding that is created, whether at the state or the federal level, to fund any of these projects. And that kind of policy change requires political coalitions in order to pass. And so in that sense, low-income communities, Black, Hispanic, marginalized groups, they are a key piece of that puzzle. And as we see in just the national presidential elections, they are central to passing important pieces of legislation. And many of them, predominantly, studies show that they are disproportionately more in favor of climate mitigation and adaptation projects compared to white or more affluent communities. So rather than I should say that, when you look at California or New York or any of this legislation that has been passed around Green New Deal or climate change, all of that has been pushed by environmental justice and low-income communities, frontline communities, whatever word you want to describe that as. So rather than seeing issues of equity and low-income communities as being the dead weight around this issue of climate change and climate action, I think they are actually the key piece that is going to enable any of us to actually achieve traction and action on this issue.
That's great, Linda. You've given the audience so many points of entry into this existential crisis, but seeing it as an opportunity to do something good for everybody. Paul Romer, who recently won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, coined the phrase many, many years ago, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste," which was then repeated by Rahm Emanuel in the White House and President Obama in the White House. This is something that we all can get involved in, and you have provided us literally with so many entry points, intellectually and practically. So on behalf of the unseen audience, I'm about to thank you, but before I do want to thank 3 other people who made this evening possible: Paige Johnston, Matt Smith, and Kat Chavez, people who keep the wheels turning, and we thank all of you behind the scenes who really make this possible as well. So Linda, it's great to see you. Thanks for spending the evening with all of us, and I look forward to talking with you in the future, and I'm sure other people will be in touch as well. Thanks very, very much.
Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.